So, last week we discussed the LSAM from For All Mankind, a show that depicts a alternate reality where the Soviets landed the first man on the moon, and I've discussed in the past why a Soviet moon landing is just not really feasible. There's a lot of obstacles that the Soviet Union had to cross to get even close to putting a man on the moon, and it would be incredibly impractical for them to dodge those obstacles. But there actually was one program that got pretty close to putting a man in orbit of the moon, or at least in the vicinity of the moon. It was a free return trajectory. And I figured today we could talk about the element of the manned lunar space race the United States actually did almost lose to the Soviets. Today, let's discuss the history of the Zond program. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So, while I was doing research for last week's video about the Lunar Surface Access Module from For All Mankind, I kind of fell down a rabbit hole of Soviet spaceflight and the Soviet moon program, and was reminded of a Soviet mission profile that I completely forgot existed, and it's the Zond program, an often overlooked series of fairly impressive cislunar missions that sent probes to the vicinity of the moon. So if any of you haven't figured out, today we're actually going to be talking about real spaceflight history. I've delved into why the Soviets couldn't land a man on the moon, and I actually did an entire video on that, so I'll leave a link up here to that. But today we're going to talk about how they really did almost send people around the moon before Apollo 8. But first off, we have to rewind and talk about the Apollo program a little bit and what the Soviets were up against. Because unlike the United States, which basically had no idea what the Soviets were doing in the realm of spaceflight until it was done, the Soviets kept their space program pretty under wraps, the Americans would broadcast it to the world, showing their launches and releasing their launch schedules as public available knowledge. So the Soviets had a good idea when the Americans were going to achieve their scheduled firsts, and that actually gave the Soviet Union a pretty big advantage early on in the space race, allowing the Soviets to seize firsts before the Americans with higher risk missions that were simpler but more dangerous. In the early days of the space race, the Soviet Union had a tendency to take the rocket they already had, the R-7, which was designed as an ICBM and used to launch Sputnik, and just kind of modified it, adding slightly larger upper stages to allow it to do more impressive things, whether it was sending the early Luna probes to the moon, launching Vostok, which carried the first person into space, or Voskhod, that carried the first multi-person crew, and ultimately that program led to the first EVA. These were all basically taking what they had and duct taping new parts on to be able to do things just to snatch firsts before the Americans. And the Soviet moon program was sort of trying to do the same thing, to some extent. Now, one of the reasons the Soviets never actually did a manned lunar landing was because you need a massive launch vehicle to be able to launch a crewed vehicle and a lander to the moon, which at the time was the perceived most efficient way of doing it. But if you're not bringing the lander, the mission gets quite a bit simple. In the middle of the 60s, a missile was designed by the Soviet Union, which would ultimately evolve into the UR-100, one of the USSR's primary ICBMs, and a modified, heavier variant of that designed to launch a much larger nuclear warhead would never see service as a combat weapon, but instead find its way into the launch vehicle market, becoming the Proton launch vehicle, which was used to launch heavier payloads for the Soviet Space Agency. Now, in the early days, it was mostly defense payloads, and it was a bit rocky in the early days of its flights, with a fairly substantial number of failures, which is not uncommon for Soviet rockets. Proton would go on, by the way, to earn a very impressive legacy, launching large communication satellites, large reconnaissance satellites, and most notably space station modules into low Earth orbit. But one of the early purposes that the Soviets came up with for it was the potential use as a manned cislunar launch vehicle, capable of putting a small manned capsule in a trajectory that would bring it around the moon. This began the Zond program, which eventually evolved into one of the most notable missions of that program, Zond 5, which we'll talk about in a second, but I want to delve back into the Proton for a bit here. The Proton had already been used to send larger payloads to the moon, so they knew it was capable of doing this, and the spacecraft that they ended up putting on top of it was really just a modified Soyuz, which was already being developed for their lunar landing program. And so they combined some elements from Soyuz that they were actually developing for the orbital version of Soyuz, slimmed it down quite a bit to reduce the weight and fit it onto the rocket, modified the fairing to have a launch abort system, and began work on what would be a manned rocket that could send a crew of 3 cosmonauts in orbit of the moon, or at least around the moon, doing what's called a free return trajectory, where they're boosted from Earth orbit into an orbit that loops them around the moon and brings them back home to Earth. The drive became to try to get a human being to circle the moon and come back before the Americans, and this was, at the time, a fairly achievable goal. They had the rocket and they began working on the spacecraft. Now, this is where the Soviets had a little bit of an advantage. In the United States, we were working on the Saturn V and the Apollo program, which was designed to put a man on the surface of the moon. The Soviets had basically 2 separate lunar programs. The L-1 program, which was the Zond program, which wanted to send a person around the moon and bring them back with no landing, and the L-3 program, which wanted to actually land a moon on the lunar surface. Because they were 2 separate programs, the demands of the program that was just going to put a man in orbit of the moon, or, around the moon, was far less intense than the demands of the landing program. That gave the Soviets a bit of an edge. They were designing a simpler rocket to do a less impressive goal. And once again, all of that culminated in the Zond 5 flight in the middle of 1968, when the Soviets launched the Zond 5 spacecraft, which circled the moon and returned to Earth with a pair of Russian tortoises and a few fruit flies on board. Those living beings became the first living creatures to venture to the moon and return to Earth. This terrified NASA. It seemed like strong evidence the Soviets were about to launch a cislunar mission, and that's not necessarily not true. In fact, the Soviets planned to launch a manned version of the Zond spacecraft in December of 1968, a few weeks before Apollo 8 would launch. This was actually planned when Apollo 8 was announced as an effort to do what the Soviets had done in the early days of the space race and snatch the first away from the Americans. But there were serious concerns about the reliability of the Zond spacecraft and the Proton rocket for manned flight, things it had never really been fully cleared to do. The Zond spacecraft would, in most cases, end up entering the atmosphere at such a dramatic speed, with such a high amount of g-forces, that it would likely kill any human beings on board, and there was a fairly good chance that if they put the 2 cosmonauts on this mission and flew them, they wouldn't make it back alive, and that would be a PR nightmare for the Soviet Union, so the decision was ultimately made to stand down from the launch attempt in December of 1968, and just a few weeks later, the Americans launched Apollo 8. With the successful flight of Apollo 8, the Soviet leadership lost all interest in flying Zond missions to the moon, and by 1969 the program was effectively cancelled, meaning that a Soviet cislunar flight never took place, but the equipment was in place, and a vehicle was actually built to fly this mission, but never actually flown. Instead, it would fly later in the following year, 1969, with no crew on board and just a scientific payload. At the end of the day, the Soviet Union never sent a person from the Earth to the moon, whether to land or circle the moon, and it marked a failed prospect within the Soviet moon program. But there was a lot of effort at that time, in late 68, early 69, from the Soviet space program to prep for the L-3 lunar manned landing. One such mission was Soyuz 4 and 5, the first successful flights of the Soyuz program, and the first docking of 2 manned spacecraft. If you'd like to learn about that mission and the often overlooked historical implications of the first docking of 2 manned spacecraft in a video that actually features a piece of Soyuz 4, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think the Soviets should have just gone for it. Do you think they blew their chance to beat the Americans to putting a man around the moon, or do you think it was genuinely too risky? After all, most of the Zond flights launched successfully, and while they did have issues coming back, it's about a 50% success rate, which is about the same success rate that the Vostok capsule had when Yuri Gagarin flew. And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in spaceflight or science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon to get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.